you. Oh, I don't think I need that. I'll just hand that off there. Good afternoon, folks. Can everybody hear me? Yes. My name is Jess Tomlin, and I'm really excited to be here today because the context of today's conversation is around rethinking and rebuilding. And I happen to have very good firsthand knowledge of the best rethinkers and the best rebuilders around the world, my bias very much included here. So I personally think, and I'm here to argue for the next 18 minutes or less, that women's rights organizations working in really complex humanitarian, political, economic contexts are of the greatest innovators around the world. So I'm here today to take you on a journey and tell you a story about what I have witnessed, whether working for the UN, working for international NGOs, or working for the grassroots women's rights organizations, which I now have come to grow and love. It didn't take very long for me to I didn't really have to go very far when I was asked to talk about rebuilding and rethinking, because my very own organization had to go through this very own thing. So the Match International has been around for 40 years. We've worked in with 650 partners in over 70 countries around the world, and we've always supported women's rights organizations working at their community to bring about change. Well, in 2010, much like 40 other women's organizations in this country, we lost our funding from the government. 75% of our operating budget overnight. Staff were let go. The storage container got opened up. Files went in there. And we were in a really critical moment in terms of how we were going to continue or not. Thankfully, Canadians like you, I'm sure around the room, and elsewhere from across the country were really, really angry that the only feminist development organization in the country had been defunded, and so they wrote letters. They marched to their MP's office. They sent money. And it gave us enough time to have an authentic reflection about how we needed to rebuild and reframe. And today I'm very happy to be here before you to tell you about my organization, which is an entirely private-run philanthropic effort which supports grassroots women's rights organizations around the world. And I'm going to use this opportunity today to talk to you about the details, to look under the hood, and to debunk some of these myths around what we know about women's rights and how we as Canadians can be doing more to support them. So my first myth is this notion that one size fits all. I think it's the easier thing to do, right? Right now, we have this sense that if you just educate a girl, or this notion of microfinance or economic empowerment, but in fact, the world's greatest challenges for women and girls tell us time and time and time again that all change is unique, and the best change is homegrown. If I can illustrate this example through the context of one particular scenario. So we launched our global grant-making effort this year, and we did it quietly because we actually didn't have that much money to give away. So we told a few people, but typical women's organizations are incredibly resourceful, and so the word got out, and we received 1,200 applications from women's organizations from over 100 countries. Each of which proposing to work in their communities at the grassroots level in incredibly unique and creative ways. But I'll draw your attention to one issue that I think is worth highlighting, and that's the issue of violence. So of these 1,200 organizations, 75% wanted money to deal with violence against women in their communities. And what I think is interesting is that of those 75%, if anybody wants to do the math quickly, you're welcome to, of those 75%, no one wanted to do it in the same way. I'm going to highlight three of our partners to give you this example. So this is one of my favorite organizations. Their name is Box Girls. And they work with 650 girls and young women in the slums of Nairobi, and they work with Olympic athletes and master coaches to teach them how to box. So on the surface, they're teaching them things like leadership and empowerment and these types of things. But what else they do is they allow these girls just for a moment to challenge their worldview. And they allow these girls to challenge the stereotypes of what that girl can be when she grows up. And finally, and most unfortunately, they give those girls a space to be safe, because many of them come from situations at home or in their communities where they're coming from sexual or other types of violence. Another example, totally other angle, is an organization we support called Studio Mobile. Studio Mobile is a Georgia-based organization that uses media, uses documentary filmmaking as a way to, to talk about human rights abuses across the countries and throughout the North Caucasus. What's interesting is they have come over the years to talk about more and more about LGBT issues because 88% of Georgians believe that homosexuality is unacceptable. So they are using mainstream media, television, documentary opportunities to shed the human rights abuses and share those on a national level with fellow Georgians. And my final example of another partner that we support, again in relation to violence against women, is an organization called Avides. Avides is a Colombian organization who's working to deal with and address and support the women's movement who are coping with the 5 million people who have been forcibly displaced or disappeared during the context of the political conflict there. And they are doing that by supporting the grassroots women's movement. They're doing that by presenting policy challenges. They're doing that by supporting women to seek justice and reparation. But what all these three examples show me, whether it's Box Girls, whether it's Avides, or whether it's Studio Mobile, is the unique ways in which women's organizations are finding homegrown solutions to address the challenges that they face, whether violence or otherwise, within their respective cultures and contexts. Whether it's at the individual level, at the systems level, at the community level. These are their homegrown solutions. Which brings me to myth number 2. Oftentimes we say to ourselves, if only we could change that national law, if only we could challenge that legislation, if only we could sign the treaty, or if only we'd be there around the table for the International Convention. And I would argue all of those things are really, really, really important, and we cannot have transformed societies without those international instruments. But the fact is, change happens from the ground up. If I can just take a minute here, because I think about this a lot, and I think this notion of these national policies, and I want to use an example here to talk about primary school education for girls. That's the big thing, and that's actually one of the national commitments and international commitments we've been able to meet. But what happens when that girl doesn't have the right to choose who she's going to marry? What happens when that girl doesn't have right to land? What happens when it's customary practice that that girl have between 6 and 8 children? What happens when that girl doesn't have the right to divorce? So while we need all of these systems changes and these big policy decisions, we also need to acknowledge that much of this change needs to happen from different angles, different entry points, driven at the community level. I illustrate this point more through one of my favorite pieces of research, which is an evidence-based 40-year longitudinal study around violence against women. And what they wanted to look at was what needed to happen in societies for true lasting change to exist for women and communities to move away from violence. Well, they looked at a number of factors over this 40-year period, and it wasn't, in fact, the key successes were not really in relation to, what you would typically think. High GDP, didn't relate to women leaders in public life. It didn't relate to women in government necessarily. It didn't actually relate to national systems and international laws and these types of things. The single most successful ingredient to improve women's long-term removal of the situation of violence was really around the robust movement of the women's rights community. Because it's the women's rights community who will be at the courthouse picketing. It's the women's rights community who will be treating the victims of violence and rape. And it's the women's community who will force the ruling of precedent-setting cases. They are finding creative solutions. Which brings me to my third myth that I'd like to debunk just for a moment. As the executive director of the Match International Women's Fund, which really strives to support women's social innovators working in really complex circumstances, I often come up against this notion that women are not innovating. And that may be because there's some sort of masculine tendencies around this notion of innovation. It's entrepreneurial, it's investment-based, it's very risky. and these types of things. And it's not to say that women aren't capable and women aren't very present in those spheres, but I believe, and I have witnessed time and time again, that in fact women are some of the most incredibly creative and resourceful and powerful innovators. There is a reason that we have coined the term necessity is the mother of invention. I've seen it with my own eyes, pardon me. I've seen women work in quiet ways, in collaborative ways, in innovative ways, in deeply complex political and humanitarian contexts. And I want to draw a couple of examples for you. The first is another organization that we support, and that's called HarassMap. So many of you may know this organization, but during the Arab Spring, during Tahrir Square, a group of women came together and tried to developed cell phone mapping technology for their smartphones where they could identify situations of rape and sexual harassment that were happening during the protests. Well, this is a fairly haram topic in Egypt, and there wasn't a lot of space for women to come out and say, look, this is happening to me in the streets. But doing it through the cell phone was an innovative way to talk about these types of things. Well, that exploded, and women found their voice. And that went from Tahrir Square to Cairo to Alexandria to all across Europe, and now it's being used even in Syria. And what's fascinating about that is not only did it give women a voice, but then it started to collect really big data. Last time I checked, Egypt's an enormous country. So they started to use this really great big data, and that big data started to inform national policies. So we started to have that systems change piece. But then that big data also created a certain shock value. And now we're seeing communities of men going out into the streets to challenge the way other men treat women in public spaces. I'll illustrate one more example just in relation to that innovation. This figure is really discouraging, but it's actually not a very good one. So over the last 11 large peace talks, formal peace talks, 8% of the people around the table were women. But what this doesn't shed light on is the stuff that women are doing outside of the formal peace processes. That's where the true innovation, I would argue, is happening. I know that in many situations where there is tribal conflict that has been going on for years and years and years, in many cases the men who need to save face will send the women. And the women will go in the depths of the night and manage very, very complex peace negotiations with each other and bring a more peaceful world to their respective villages and communities. There's no other better example than Leymah Gandy, who recently won a Nobel Peace Prize for the sex strike that she led in Liberia, which saw an end to 14 years of civil war. It's just unfortunate that these quieter innovations, the things that happen under the radar and maybe around the kitchen table, are not resourced and supported in the way that they perhaps should be. Which brings me to my point number 4, that women's rights makes for great marketing. So women, I'm thrilled, but women and girls are really all the rage, right? They really are the center of the marketing and fundraising platform of development and charitable efforts, largely in part of the fact that it's women who are largely giving to these causes, but really it's really shed light on the key role women and girls play in transforming societies. This notion of what we're seeing today, I went back to this notion of educating a girl, right? It's all around the girl and how much potential she has and how much we could save the world if only we would save the girl. But I regret to inform you that, in fact, it's a lot more messy than that. We've made it too simple, and I think we've done a great disservice to ourselves. If we really, really want to rebuild and rethink, I beg you, open the hood. We can't just talk about simple solutions. We can't just gloss it over and make it great marketing and PR. We cannot talk about fundamentally transforming society for a more equal world between men and women if we don't talk about sexual and reproductive rights. If we don't talk about rape being consistently used as a weapon of war. If we don't talk about prostitution and trafficking, both of which are on the rise. If we don't talk about the fact that this year 14 million girls will become child brides. And if we don't talk about the fact that 3 million women this year will be subject to female genital mutilation. We need to look under the hood, and I think we can do that. Which brings me to my fifth myth. Given all these fantastic marketing and fundraising strategies, one would think that there would be tons of money for women's organizations working around the world, but that's not true. And I am the bearer of bad news. So the people who are working at the grassroots level, the people who have been there for 30 years and will be there for 30 more, the people who don't necessarily have the fancy offices and the big structures and the alignment with government systems, those organizations are chronically underfunded. 90% of those organizations cannot access funds from the UN or bilateral government systems. 50% of those organizations have not had funding for more than a year. The average annual budget of these organizations is $20,000 US a year. In sub-Saharan Africa, that's 12,000. They are desperately, desperately insecure. And 1 in 5 this year, one in 5 this month, will be at the risk of having to close their doors forever. But they continue. They continue when their doors are locked and they're kicked out of their offices. They move their office to underneath the baobab tree. I've seen it. When they're pushed out of public spaces, they move to the kitchen table. And when their hard-won legal gains are challenged, they are outside the courthouse with homemade picket signs, just like they would be here in Canada. Which brings me to my sixth myth, that feminism is dead. This is the one I really want to blow out of the water. Perhaps you weren't looking, but there's a revival afoot, and it's fantastic. And it involves men, and it involves women, and it involves communities, and it's global. I can give you 3 famous examples, but I could give you 5,000 others, right? One of the most powerful women in the world, as she is so named, Sheryl Sandberg, dedicated her entire PR prowess to talking about the importance of equality between men and women and what women needed to do to achieve that, instead of writing how I made a great success of my business. Beyonce, who certainly didn't need to, nobody was asking her to, came out of the feminist closet. And this great article, and if you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so, in The Atlantic, stirred national and international debate around the fact that women really can't have it all. We still do not have an equal society. There are countless others, and I'm sure that I could go around this room and ask each of you to name one single person who has tried to enter this conversation. And I think that that's really inspiring, and that's exactly the kind of movement that we need in order to ensure that we're opening and looking at what's underneath the hood. So I want to leave you today with what I have come to believe, and I hope you are now somewhat convinced, are some of the greatest assets in rethinking and rebuilding, transforming our society for a more equal world and a more just society for women and girls. These women's organizations, whether working in Canada or working in a village in Kisumu, Kenya, these organizations are the reason that feminism is cool chatter around the water cooler again. They are the reason that we are all outraged when a woman is gang raped in India. They are the reason we are leaning in. They are the reason that every single person in this room knows the name of the 16-year-old girl who was shot in the head in the Swat Valley. And I want you to, just for a moment, imagine a world where these expert rethinkers and expert rebuilders were truly empowered and supported to do what they know what to do best. Thank you.